Maris looked at my sun-faded Ford Fusion and laughed under her breath, like the car had offended her. We were parked outside a fundraiser, and she'd just spent 10 minutes fixing her hair in the mirror. When she said, "You still drive this thing?" I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my face blank. My name was Tanner Hollis. I was 57 years old, and for the last 8 years I'd lived in Durham, North Carolina, acting like I was just another guy who fixed hospital messes for a living. Most folks called me steady. I rented a plain 2-bedroom outside the city where the neighbors kept to themselves. My furniture was secondhand and functional. I didn't wear loud brands or flash a watch. I bought boots that lasted, kept receipts, and stayed quiet about money because I'd grown up watching grown people scream over rent. I kept to myself. By then, I had learned that the less I explained myself, the more accurately people revealed what they assumed. If somebody asked what I did, I said, "Medical operations consulting," and I let them get bored. I showed up, fixed workflow, cut waste, and went home. I kept my online life thin. No brag posts, no grind set nonsense. The mask worked. It made me harmless. The engine under it started with a recovery protocol I built for post-op patients. It wasn't an app or a shiny platform. It was training, checklists, paper tools, follow-up calls, and audits that kept people from bouncing back into the hospital. I tested it at a few community places, tightened it up, and packaged it so hospitals could license it without needing me in the room. A bigger medical company wanted it. I sold the rights for $4.2 million and kept a royalty deal that dropped $44,800 a month into an account every month without fail. Over time, I bought 4 small rentals, duplexes and modest houses, and hired a property manager so I never got midnight calls about busted water heaters. Only 3 people knew the whole picture. Gwen Ralston, my financial advisor who kept things boring, Imani Okoye, my attorney who kept my paperwork mean, and my older brother Blaine, because years back I'd helped him with a down payment and he'd sworn to keep his mouth shut. Then Maris Whitlock walked into my life. She was 46 and ran a boutique architecture firm. She didn't enter rooms, she claimed them. We met on a redevelopment panel, ran into each other at a charity event, and fell into a routine of coffee, errands, and dinners where she talked and I listened. I didn't tell her about the royalties or the properties. I called it privacy. What mattered to me was whether she wanted me or the math. One night in my kitchen with the sink running and my cheap stove clicking, I pulled a ring from my pocket and slid it onto her finger. Maris held her hand under the kitchen light and turned the ring like she was grating it. Her smile flashed, then she said, "You really proposed over a running sink," like she couldn't decide if she loved it or hated it. I told her, "I proposed where my life happens, and I'm not putting on a show," and I shut the water off. For a stretch after that, we ran smooth. We talked about a small wedding the next year and argued over dumb stuff like catering, not values. She started leaving little pieces of herself in my apartment, and I let it happen because it felt like commitment, not an invasion. The shift started about 10 months before the date we'd been circling. Her firm took on 2 commercial renovation jobs at once, and stress rode her everywhere. One project came with a lender who watched cash flow and liability close, and Maris started acting like privacy was a liability. She checked her phone through dinner and went quiet like she was reading warnings only she could see. After that, she started tossing out divorce stories, men who lost everything, friends who got dragged through court. And it didn't feel like gossip. It felt like rehearsal, like she was testing the words in her mouth. One night she forwarded me an article about protecting premarital assets with no message, and I read it, set my phone down, and didn't give her a reaction. She watched me, hungry for a fight, then swallowed it and moved on. When she finally said the word prenup, she picked a downtown French bistro that felt built for optics. The tables were dressed up, the lighting was low, and the servers moved like they were trained not to exist. Maris ordered wine like she was closing a deal, then slid a folder across the table. "I built my firm from nothing," she said, calm but tight. "I need to protect what I built. It's not personal, it's just smart." I nodded and said, "That's reasonable, and I'm not going to pretend I'm offended." Relief hit her face fast, and she squeezed my hand like she'd just dodged a crash. "You're different than most men, Tanner," she said. "You're practical, and that's why I feel safe doing this." Then she added, almost offhand, "My attorney already has a draft framework ready." I kept my tone even. I'll have my own lawyer review anything before I sign, I said. Maris blinked like the idea of me having legal support had never crossed her mind. Then she forced a smile and said, "Good, that makes it cleaner." After that, she went warm again, talking honeymoon spots and venues like we'd planned a trip and not a power structure. In the parking lot, I slid into my Fusion and cranked the heat. I called Imani before I pulled out and told her Maris wanted a prenup and had a draft coming. Imani said, "Let them send it. Do not react, and forward it the second it hits your inbox." Then added, "Tanner, this is where you learn what kind of marriage she's planning, not just what kind of contract." I ended the call and drove out into the dark. 5 days later, Maris's attorney sent the draft to my email like he was sending a dinner invitation. The message was all smiles and responsible adults, with that fake warmth people use when they want you to sign something without reading too hard. I opened the attachment at my kitchen table and pulled my coffee closer, already annoyed at how polite the whole thing sounded. The document itself didn't feel polite. It read like a blueprint for who was allowed to be big and who was expected to stay small, and it didn't hide that it picked her as the big one by default. I read it once fast, then I read it again slower, because my gut was already pulling away and I wanted facts, not mood. Halfway through, my coffee started tasting bitter, and I stopped drinking it because I refused to blame the coffee for what was sitting on the page. One clause said any real estate bought during the marriage would default to her as primary ownership, unless I could prove, within 45 days of separation, that I'd covered more than 60% of the purchase price. It was like the marriage was a ledger, and I'd be on a timer to defend myself. Another clause waived any claim I might ever have for support under any circumstance, even if we stayed married for decades, or my income got cut, or I got sick. That wasn't protecting her firm. That was building an escape hatch while locking my door from the outside. Then I hit the lopsided inheritance language, where her future inheritance stayed separate, but mine, if I ever received any, became marital. That one wasn't subtle. It was just greedy with a law degree. After that, my stomach tightened when I saw the clause that required her written approval for any personal expenditure I made over $1,500. I'd paid my own bills since I was 17, and seeing that in writing felt like somebody trying to slip a collar around my neck while smiling. There was also a household stability section that said if I expanded any professional venture during the marriage, she'd be entitled to a 25% stake because her presence would count as support. It was written like romance, priced like ownership, and it made my hands go cold on the paper. I forwarded the whole thing to Imani with no commentary, because I didn't need to vent. I needed a professional. 12 minutes later, she called and said, he actually let this leave his office, like she was impressed by the audacity more than shocked by it. Imani didn't waste time. We send a counter that looks normal, she said, but we add mutual full financial disclosure, documented and verified. She let that sit for a beat, then added, they'll think that clause protects them because they think you're smaller than them. That week dragged and Maris acted normal, even sweet, like she expected me to fall into line without asking questions. When she brushed my shoulder and said, "This is just grown-up planning, Tanner, so please don't make it weird," I nodded and let it pass. The longer I watched her, the more I noticed things I'd ignored. She framed trips and dinners like she'd made them possible, and she corrected little details in public like she was training me for a role. 2 nights before the scheduled signing, I met Blaine for wings and iced tea, and I slid my phone across the table with the spending approval clause pulled up. He stared at it and said, "That's not a prenup, Tanner, that's a leash." Then he leaned in and added, "I've also heard her firm's been bouncing around lenders lately, so watch for debt hiding under the protect what I built speech." And I flagged the clause again with my thumb. Blaine saw what I was focused on, and he didn't soften his face to spare me. He leaned back in the booth, wiped his fingers on a napkin, and said, "If she's trying to put that in writing now, imagine what she'll try to slide in later." I didn't argue with him, and I didn't defend her out of habit either. I paid the check, walked out into the humid night, and kept my mouth shut because the next move wasn't emotional, it was procedural. The signing was set for that week in a conference room inside an old bank building downtown, with high ceilings and polished wood that made the place feel like it was judging you. Maris called it neutral ground, which told me she thought in chessboards and liked home field advantage dressed up as fairness. I showed up early enough to see the lobby security guard glance at my blazer like he'd already decided I didn't belong there, and I let him think it. Maris was already in the room when I walked in, dressed sharp with a calm face and tight eyes that didn't match her smile. Her attorney, Kip Hargrove, stood beside her with gray hair and that old-school lawyer vibe, polite tone on top and cold math underneath. He shook my hand like he was measuring grip strength, then gestured toward a chair like he was doing me a favor. I came in quiet, plain blazer and slacks, nothing flashy, nothing that hinted at anything. I looked like what they expected, a steady hospital consultant with a retirement account and a paid-off car, the kind of guy who'd sign whatever to keep the peace. I sat down, set my hands on the table, and kept my expression boring. Imani arrived last, and the room reacted to her like it had to make space. She carried one thick folder like it weighed nothing, nodded once at me, and took her seat without apologizing for being on time. Kip tried to control the tempo right away, sliding papers forward and starting his speech like this was a presentation. He went through Maris's disclosures with a little pride, listing her firm's valuation, equipment leases, a condo, and a couple investment accounts. He said it like he was laying trophies on the table, and Maris sat with her chin up like it proved she was the builder and I was the add-on. She didn't look at me much, like eye contact might invite questions. Then Imani slid our counter across the table and said, plain and steady, "My client accepts the basic framework with one addition. Full mutual financial disclosure, documented and verified." Kip hesitated, but he didn't fight it, because to him it probably sounded like standard practice. Maris glanced at me and gave a small smile like, "See, we're doing this the right way, so don't get difficult." Imani opened her folder and laid out my disclosure documents in clean stacks. Tax returns, royalty statements, property deeds, investment summaries. The room changed fast. Every page turn sounded louder than it should have. Kip's face went through stages: professional calm, quick confusion, then a hard recalculation, and he started flipping pages faster like he could outrun the numbers. Maris picked up one page and stared, and I watched the moment she understood what she was reading. Monthly royalties, the sale amount, the properties lined up like facts that didn't care about her story. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, like she was trying to pick a reaction that wouldn't expose her. Kip cleared his throat and asked, careful, "Can we confirm these figures are verified through source documentation?" And Imani answered without blinking. "Everything is documented, clean, and available for review." Maris didn't explode and she didn't cry, which almost made it worse. Her face went stiff and her eyes went flat, not hurt, not betrayed, just scared in a different way. She said low, "How long have you had this?" Like my mistake was existing bigger than the version of me she'd built in her head. And then she said what she really meant. "Do you understand what this makes me look like?" Kip asked for a break, and Maris stood up so fast her chair scraped the wood. She walked out without looking at me, like eye contact would make it real, and the door didn't slam. It clicked shut while I stayed seated at the table. Imani didn't chase Maris into the hallway, and neither did I. Kip mumbled something about taking a moment, then scooped his papers like they were suddenly fragile. I sat there listening to the building's old air system hum, feeling the stupid urge to smooth it over rise in my chest, and I crushed it before it reached my mouth. Imani leaned toward me and said, "Do not follow her, and do not start apologizing for facts." Then she shut her folder like the conversation was already over. I walked out with Imani beside me, past the lobby guard who wouldn't meet my eyes now. In the parking deck, my car smelled like warm plastic and stale heat, and my phone lit up before I even turned the key. Maris didn't call that night, but she texted twice. The first message said, "We need to talk," and the second came later and said, "This isn't finished." I read both, set the phone face down, and drove home without answering because I wasn't about to bargain with someone who treated my life like a reputation hazard. 3 days later, she showed up at my apartment like she had an appointment. Her hair was done, makeup was on, and she still looked wrecked, like sleep had been optional and anger had been mandatory. She stepped inside, glanced around like she was assessing the room for weaknesses, and sat on my couch with her back straight like it was a conference chair. I stayed standing a second longer than polite, then sat across from her and kept my hands visible, because I'd learned she liked control and hated uncertainty. "I overreacted," she said, and the words sounded practiced, not felt. She didn't wait for my response before she pivoted into the real pitch. "You don't get it, Tanner," she said, tight and quick. "My clients, my peers, they'll think I'm marrying up, and they'll think I needed you." I stared at her and said, I thought we were just getting married, and I thought that was supposed to be the point. She waved that off with a small motion like I was being cute, then leaned forward. We can still do this, she said. We just need to be strategic about it, because people talk and it follows you. Her eyes kept flicking to my kitchen like she could see my bank statements through the cabinets. Then she laid out her solution like it was a peace offering. She wanted me to sign a separate agreement, not the prenup. Something that legally required me to keep my income, royalties, and assets confidential from anyone in our circle. She called it protecting both of us. But she kept saying her reputation, her firm, her standing, like my name was a tool she needed to manage. I asked her straight, so you want me legally bound to pretend I'm less so you can feel bigger in front of your people? She said, that's not what I mean. But she didn't correct it, and that silence told the truth louder than her words. Then she added the second piece like it was no big deal. She said she might need me to help with a short-term cash bridge for her firm. Not a gift, just my signature as support, until receivables clear. Blaine's warning hit my brain like a hard click, and I saw the shape of it all at once. I kept my voice calm and said, no, I'm not signing anything that makes me hide my life or ties my name to your business debts. Her face turned cold so fast it was almost impressive. You embarrassed me on purpose, she said, and her voice got sharp. You ambushed me in front of attorneys. I didn't raise mine. You asked for a contract and my lawyer asked for mutual disclosure, I said. That's what doing it right looks like when it's actually equal. Maris pulled the ring off her finger, not dramatic, not thrown, and placed it on my coffee table like she was closing a file. I looked at it and said, I'm not marrying into a situation where my job is protecting your image by erasing myself. She stood, walked to the door, and left without yelling, and I waited for the latch to catch before I turned the deadbolt with my own hand. My hand stayed on the deadbolt for a second after it clicked, like I needed the metal to confirm what my brain already knew. I listened to the hallway go quiet. Then I walked back into my living room and started clearing the coffee table the way I always did when my nerves wanted something to do. I didn't call anyone to process it, and I didn't fire off a long text to defend myself. I just put the apartment back in order and went to bed like discipline could mop up a mess. The next couple weeks weren't loud. They were worse than loud because they came through other people. I'd get a checking in text from somebody I hadn't heard from in months, and I could hear the story hiding under the words, like a smile with teeth behind it. The version that kept popping up, through mutual friends, through Blaine, through a guy I used to run projects with, was that I'd lied for years, that I'd set Maris up, that I'd waited to spring money on her like a weapon. I didn't chase it. I wasn't going to run around town explaining myself like a kid in the principal's office, begging for fairness from people who loved drama more than truth. I kept working. I went to the gym. I made my meals. But I could feel my name getting tugged in rooms I wasn't in, like somebody was testing how far it would stretch before it snapped. Janelle Cole, who I knew from the same redevelopment circles where Maris liked to hold court, called me one afternoon while I was unloading groceries, and she didn't bother with small talk. You're being painted like a con man in loafers, she said, sharp and matter-of-fact, like she was reporting weather. Then she sent me a screenshot from a group chat I wasn't in, full of little digs and fake concern. People acting like they were protecting Maris from some secret monster. I read it, felt my face go hot for about 2 seconds, and then it cooled into something steadier. What I noticed, though, was the rumor had a weak spot. Even people leaning toward Maris kept circling one basic question, and it wasn't emotional, it was logical. Why did she need a prenup that bad if she thought I was broke? That question moved faster than the insults because it didn't depend on charm. Once people heard it, they kept coming back to it. Around that time, Imani forwarded me an email from Kip Hargrove. It was short, professional, and careful. He said prenups reveal character, wished me well, and stopped there. No apology, no confession, just enough to make it clear he wanted distance from what he'd drafted. I replied to Imani with one line, "Save that message," and she wrote back, "Already saved." Blaine called later and said, "I'm hearing she's been pushing hard to get personal guarantees off her back," and his tone had that flat edge he used when he smelled a setup. It wasn't confirmed, but it lined up too cleanly with Maris asking for a bridge like it was normal. Imani didn't guess, she checked. She pulled public records and filings tied to Maris's business entities, and found liens and financing statements that didn't match the shiny, self-made story Maris sold socially. Janelle invited me to a small dinner party to get me back into normal life, and I went mostly to prove I wasn't hiding. Two people asked careful questions about the breakup, and I gave them one sentence with my fork still in my hand. She wanted control clauses, and I said no. Then I reached for my water and kept eating. I let the table talk slide past me, thanked Janelle for the invite, and went home. About 6 weeks after that bank building mess, my phone rang at 7:10 in the morning, and Blaine's name lit up the screen. He didn't bother easing in. "Your ex's name is showing up near my work, and I figured you'd want to hear it from me," he said. Blaine didn't call that early unless something was wrong or something was funny, and his voice wasn't laughing. He told me he'd been brought in to inspect a renovated commercial space for compliance issues, fire safety and access routes and basic code stuff, and the project was tied to a contractor who worked with Maris's firm sometimes. Blaine kept his tone careful, but the message was blunt. "The paperwork looks too clean, like somebody copied signatures and hoped no one would notice," he said. He wasn't accusing Maris directly, but he was warning me where this could go if an inspection turned into a fight. "If she gets heat for a bad job, she might try to drag your name into it just to muddy the water, so keep your ears open," he added, and I told him, "I'm listening, and I'm not signing a thing." 2 days later, I got a very polite email from Maris's office manager, and the politeness was polished enough to make me suspicious. She asked if I could confirm I was aware of Maris's role on a project connected to a medical tenant, like this was casual admin cleanup. The wording read like reputation insurance, like they wanted a paper trail that said I knew and approved and stood behind whatever was coming. I forwarded it to Imani without replying, and I texted her, "This looks like they're building a story." Then I put my phone down and went to work. Then the real hook showed up, and it didn't come from Maris. A small regional bank contacted Imani's office asking to verify whether I'd ever agreed to be a supporting party on a line of credit tied to one of Maris's business entities. Imani asked for the document they were referencing, and the bank sent a scan that made my stomach go tight in a quiet way. My name wasn't signed, but it was typed in places it shouldn't have been, like somebody had floated it as an option in negotiations and hoped it would become true by repetition. Imani handled it like she handled everything, direct and precise. "You did not agree to anything, and we are going to say that in writing," she told me. She replied to the bank with a formal statement that I had not authorized any support and any representation otherwise was false, and she copied me so I could see every word. I read it twice, then filed it where it belonged. Because feelings don't protect you. Paperwork does. When Maris found out the bank had reached out, she called me directly for the first time in weeks. Her tone wasn't romantic, and it wasn't even angry. It was business panic trying to sound offended. "Why are you doing this to me, Tanner, when you know what this could do?" she said, like my refusal to be used was a personal attack. I kept my voice flat and said, "I didn't do anything, and I'm not signing what I didn't sign." She tried to pivot into guilt, talking about how I was ruining what she built and how I was being punitive, and I cut it off with, "This is on you and I'm done talking." Then I ended the call. Blaine met me a couple days later and didn't sugarcoat what his work found. He said the inspection flagged enough issues to delay the project's sign-off, and delays like that cost real money and real credibility. He leaned forward and said, "If she's been playing loose with contractors, this is where it catches her." And I nodded because that sounded exactly like Maris. Tight control on the surface, messy corners underneath. Around the same time, the medical company that owned my recovery protocol sent notice requesting a royalty review. It may have been routine, and I had no proof it was connected to anything else, but the timing added pressure. Gwen told me, "Reviews happen, and you stay calm and let the process work." And Imani said, "We treat timing as information, so we respond like professionals and we do not blink." Imani handled the review like a machine, demanding documentation, setting deadlines, and making it clear I wasn't a man who panicked into giving up contract rights, and the company backed off the aggressive parts fast. I saved Imani's final email thread to my records folder, closed my laptop, and walked out the door to start my day. Outside my apartment, the morning air hit my face and I kept moving like nothing had happened. By late fall, the routine still held, but the edge in my chest didn't. I'd catch myself replaying Maris's face in that bank room. Then I'd get angry that I was still replaying her for nothing. So I booked an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Celine Hart. Not because I was falling apart, but because I refused to let bitterness become my personality. Celine's office smelled like peppermint tea and printer paper, and her voice stayed soft even when her questions didn't. In the first session, she asked why I'd hidden my finances, and I gave her the clean answer: privacy, safety, not wanting to be treated different. She nodded like she'd heard that 1,000 times, then asked, "And what were you testing when you kept it quiet?" I didn't like that question, and I told her, I wasn't playing games, I was protecting myself. She didn't argue, and the silence did the work whether I liked it or not. Over a couple sessions, I admitted the truth. I'd been watching for whether someone would care enough to notice the parts of me that didn't add up. The way I lived plain while I never stressed about money. Celine leaned forward and said, "That's a strategy, Tanner. It protected you, and it also kept you lonely." I exhaled hard, because she wasn't wrong, and because hearing it out loud made it feel less like wisdom and more like a bad habit I could quit. Janelle decided therapy wasn't enough and volunteered me for a literacy nonprofit event without asking. She texted me an address and a time and added, "Wear something you can move in, because you need people and I am not negotiating." The community center smelled like old books and bad coffee, and the place buzzed with folding tables, donated supplies, and good-hearted chaos. It was the opposite of Maris's staged rooms, and my shoulders dropped before I even noticed. They put me on book sorting and sign-up sheets, and I liked it because it was useful. That's where I met Laura Benton, 41, who ran adult literacy classes and moved through the room like she cared if people felt seen. She picked up a battered cookbook and said, "Every donation pile has the same 3 cookbooks, and somehow they all taste like regret." I laughed harder than I meant to, and she smirked like she'd just pulled a real laugh out of me. While we worked, she asked what I did, and when I gave my short answer, she didn't pivot to status. She asked, "What part of that work makes you proud when you go home?" I told her I'd helped hospitals cut complications by tightening follow-up and training, and she asked 2 quick questions that proved she listened, not collected ammo. At the end of the night, she wiped her hands on a towel and said, "I like talking to you, so do you want coffee soon?" I said yes, and the next couple months coffee turned into dinner, then a Sunday walk through a used bookstore where she stopped to read the flap like it mattered. When I finally told her the basics, royalties, some rentals, and the prenup mess, I kept it plain. Laura nodded once and said, "That sounds exhausting, and I'm glad you didn't give up your peace." Then she reached across the table and I took her hand. Her palm was warm, and I held it long enough to feel like I wasn't bracing for a hit. After we parted, I went home and tried to keep that calm, but Maris still worked the angles through other people. Janelle called and said, "She's telling folks you're unstable and secretive, and she's bragging she saved herself with that prenup." She also said Maris kept hinting she had proof I'd misled her, but nobody ever showed anything except hints. I didn't clap back on social media or at parties, because that's how you keep it burning. Imani sent a formal notice to Kip Hargrove's office. No more defamation, no more implying I'd agreed to support Maris's business, and no more using my name with any bank, client, or lender. I read it, approved it, and let Imani send it without drama, because clean paperwork beats angry speeches. Kip wrote back like a man trying to step away from trouble. He confirmed, in writing, that I had not signed any guarantee or support document, and he didn't defend Maris with fancy explanations. That one email mattered more than a dozen rumors, and it made people careful about repeating her version out loud. Blaine told me her project inspection issues had escalated enough to delay occupancy and trigger penalties, and in her world, delays like that cost cash and credibility fast. Around the same time, Gwen told me the royalty contract review ended in my favor, because Imani pushed back and the medical company backed off the parts that tried to tighten reporting terms. I didn't need applause, I just needed my boundaries in writing. Maris tried one last fix when she realized she couldn't bully the situation into looking pretty. She asked to meet in a public place, like a coffee shop would make her safer, and I agreed because I wanted closure, not because I wanted her back. I showed up early and picked a table where I could see the door and the register. She walked in calm and practiced, sat down and said, "We've both been misunderstood, and I want to make this right." Then she offered a deal. She'd stop talking if I signed a short joint statement for our circle saying we ended things amicably, and that the prenup process was mutual and respectful. She kept stressing mutual, Like the word could erase the control clauses in the bank call. I looked at her and said, "You don't get access to my credibility after trying to control my life." She called me cold, said I was scared of real partnership, and claimed I was punishing her for being ambitious. And I didn't flinch. I said, "Ambition isn't the issue because control is." Then I stood up, left cash on the table, walked out, and blocked her number before I reached my car. I slid my phone into my pocket, started the Fusion, and pulled out of the lot with my hands steady on the wheel. The streetlights flashed across the windshield, and I let the silence settle. About 16 months after that bank building conference room, my life still looked normal on the surface. Same car, same grocery store, same quiet apartment outside Durham. The difference was I felt lighter, because I wasn't carrying somebody else's image on my back anymore. I still lived quietly, but I stopped shrinking myself just to keep peace. Laura and I built something steady, not fast and not flashy. We cooked simple meals, took walks after work, and sometimes showed up at her literacy classes early to set up chairs and straighten the sign-in sheets. I met people who worked 2 jobs and still struggled just to read a lease or fill out a form, and it kept my ego in check. When Laura thanked me, she meant it like a fact, not a performance, and I liked that. In therapy, Celine asked me why I'd always used privacy like a shield. I gave my old answer, then she asked, "Do you still want to test people before you trust them?" I stared at the carpet, felt my jaw clamp, and then I said, "No, I'm tired of running experiments on my own life." Celine nodded once and told me to practice being clear instead of being hidden, and I wrote that down before I could argue. Laura never demanded numbers, but when things got serious, she looked me in the eye and said, "I need to understand the basics so we can plan like adults, and I'm not asking for control." There was no jealousy in her voice, and there was no pride game either. We sat down with Gwen at her office and went through everything. Royalties, rentals, retirement, insurance. Slow and boring, the way good planning should feel. Laura took notes, asked what she didn't understand, and didn't act like any of it belonged to her by default. One morning in my kitchen, while coffee brewed and the news murmured low, Laura set her mug down and said, "I want to build a life with you for real, so are you in?" I didn't hesitate, and I didn't feel that old fear behind my teeth. I said, "Yes, I'm in, and I'm done hiding." We talked about a simple agreement with fair boundaries. Then I emailed Imani to draft it and asked Laura to be on the thread, and she replied with a quick smile. Later, Janelle mentioned Maris had downsized her firm and restructured, and I let that information pass without digging for details. The closest thing to closure came when I ran into Kip Hargrove outside the courthouse, while I was with Imani for paperwork. He nodded at me and said quiet, "You handled that better than most," and I nodded back, then walked outside with my folder under my arm. Quick question. When someone wants protection, that really means control. Do you shrink or walk away? Tap hype if you have it. Then subscribe, like, it's one click, and comment good story or your answer.